My name is Jason, and I have a story that happened to me a few years ago. I won't mention the national forest I was working for, as I don't want this story to come back on me in any way. I took a job as a Fire Tower Watchman for the quiet and solitude. I needed a getaway, and I've always loved the outdoors and knew this was the perfect job for me. However, I would later find out I could not have been more wrong. I had a daily routine that included scanning the horizon for smoke, logging weather data, occasionally chatting with the ranger station via radio, and so on. It would probably be considered boring for a normal person, but it was perfect for me, as I've always been kind of a loner and didn't have a big family I was super close with. So far this summer had been perfect, but that quickly changed once I saw the lights. I won't forget it. It was a Tuesday night. The sun was starting to set, and I watched as the darkness slowly started to cover the treetops. This was one of my favorite times during the day, so I grabbed my tea and stepped out to the deck to watch the scenery. That is when I saw it. It was these small, flickering lights. It was really far away, and I'm surprised I even saw them without my binoculars. I went back inside to grab them. When I got back, I noticed they had slightly moved from the position they were just in a few moments ago. Even with the binoculars, I still couldn't tell exactly what I was looking at. At first, I thought it must have been campers or hikers with flashlights, but we were really far out here, and rarely did I see anyone. Campers and hikers are supposed to report to the ranger station, so I decided to radio in to check. When I radioed in, Frank was the one to respond. Frank was an older guy who had been working out here forever, and I often chatted with him when he worked. He answered in his usual friendly way and asked what was up. I told him about the lights I was seeing and asked if any campers had checked in and if anyone should be out here this late. His tone seemed to immediately change, almost serious, not like Frank. He told me there had been, and not to worry about it. I said okay and ended the radio call. His tone struck me as odd, but I thought maybe he was annoyed that people were out here or something, so I just let it go. I watched the lights for a few more minutes and decided it was time for bed. I woke up the next day having completely forgotten about the lights. I went about my daily routine and nothing out of the ordinary happened. Once again, I looked outside and I could see the sun setting. Walking back onto the deck, I enjoyed the peaceful moment of the scenery. However, no sooner did I walk outside, I saw again the lights, but this time they were much closer to the tower. I pulled up my binoculars and looked into the forest to figure out exactly what I was looking at. Even though they were closer this time, they're still far enough away I couldn't exactly make out what I was looking at. The more I looked at them, the less they looked like flashlights. But even if they were just campers, why would they not have set up a camp and started a fire at this point? Why would they just be walking around with flashlights? I decided to radio back to the station to check again and see if anyone should be out here. Frank once again was on the other side of the radio. I told him about the lights, and I really didn't think they were campers. Frank became really serious once again and told me I just needed to ignore it. I tried to get more information out of him, but he just kept telling me to ignore the lights and go about my business. I really couldn't shake the feeling how weird all of this was. It was literally our job to make sure that the forest and the people in it stayed safe, but Frank was insistent that I just ignore it? Against what I felt was against my better judgment at that time, I decided to listen to Frank and just ignore the lights. I decided just to go to bed. The next day came and passed. Once again, the lights showed up. They were even closer this time. Ignoring them was becoming increasingly difficult. They seemed to be slowly moving closer and closer. I almost didn't even need my binoculars to see them now. It was clear these were not flashlights. I didn't even bother calling this in to avoid upsetting Frank. I pulled down my shades, locked the door, and tried to go to sleep. It was difficult, but I did finally pass out. The next night, the lights were so close I could see them from my tower without binoculars. They were no longer just flickers in the distance, they were large orbs, almost the size of a basketball. I could almost feel them humming. I know it sounds weird to say I could feel a sound, but it's the best way to describe it. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to find out what it was. I decided to go against Frank's wishes and made the decision to go check these lights out. I'm a bigger guy, so there really wasn't much that frightened me. However, I will admit that there was a part of me in the back of my head trying to convince myself not to go. Grabbing my flashlight and a jacket, I climbed down the stairs and made my way into the woods. The lights weren't far from the tower, and I figured it would only take me a few minutes to get there. As I walked deeper into the woods, I could finally start to see a soft glow. It must be the lights I had been seeing. When I had finally gotten close enough to where I should have been able to see what was causing the lights, they instantly vanished. It was almost like a light switch had been instantly turned off. I shined my flashlight around, but there was nothing. Just a slight breeze and frogs in the distance. I was about to give up and go back when suddenly I heard voices. But not just any voice. It was almost like it was coming from inside my head. I honestly have no idea how to explain it any better. At first it was like a room full of people, but they were all whispering and having different conversations. I couldn't make out what anyone was saying or if it was even English. The voices grew louder, yet still a whisper. It almost started hurting my head. Then, they stopped. Suddenly, I was surrounded by several white, glowing balls of light. They were so bright, it was almost hard to look at. Then, I heard a voice. I will never forget this voice. It simply said, "Hello." The sheer force of the voice and the bright lights instantly blurred my vision, and everything around me started spinning. I felt myself collapsing, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in the tower, lying in my bed. My flashlight and jacket were neatly placed beside me, as if I'd never left. Dazed and confused, I sat up and tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it been a dream? It felt too real. Not knowing what to do, I decided to write it off as a crazy dream. Days turned to weeks, and life in the tower returned to its normal, boring routine. No lights, no more voices, nothing. It became the end of my time there for the summer, and I packed up my belongings. I hiked back to the ranger station to check out and get my car keys. Frank was there, and he seemed much different now seeing me in person. He asked how my time was up there. I told him it was great. He looked at me hesitantly and made a weird joke about he didn't think I was going to make it all summer after those campers' flashlights scared me. I awkwardly laughed, but didn't say anything. I started grabbing everything out of my locker, and I noticed him writing something down on his notebook and glanced up at me a couple times. I did my best not to make eye contact. The way he was acting made me really suspicious. As I finished grabbing my things, someone came into the office and started asking about information on the forest. Frank walked around the counter and took them to the section of brochures they had in the front office about various activities the forest provided. As I walked past the front desk to leave, I saw Frank's notebook still open, just laying there. I glanced up at Frank, who was not looking at me. My curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped the notebook around to see exactly what he wrote. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. What I saw simply said, "Jason saw the lights." I quickly walked out of that office and got as much distance from that forest as I possibly could. This confirmed it for me. It wasn't a dream. And they knew about the lights. To this day, I still think about what actually happened to me out there and what those lights really were. I may never find out, and honestly, I don't know if I even want to know. I'll never forget my first solo shift as a Fire Tower Watchman. I had gone through all the training, sure, but nothing really prepares you for being out there alone. When I arrived, I had to get all of my supplies for my car. I knew it was going to take a few trips back and forth, and I already had gotten to a late start. I knew I needed to hurry if I wanted to get everything to the tower before dark. After my third trip back to the station, I managed to get the rest of my stuff and started heading back to the tower for the final time. I remember seeing the sun slowly starting to set, and even though I was exhausted at this point, I knew I needed to push myself as this area was known for its grizzly bears and wolf population. Finally, I saw the tower. I had made it, with probably half an hour to spare before total darkness. I had a generator at the tower, so I knew I could have a little light to actually unpack once I got up top. As soon as I got to the stairs, I stopped and braced myself for the long walk up. I was no more than 10 steps up when I heard something off behind me in the woods. It sounded like someone had stepped on a branch and broke it. I looked around, shined my light in the area, but nothing. I called out to see if anyone was there. There was no answer, just silence. Figuring it was probably an animal, I hurried up the stairs, looking down in that direction each time that I circled by that side of the woods for each flight of stairs I climbed. Once I got to the top, I started unpacking my gear and getting everything organized and cozy for the next 2 months I would be staying there. I got the small propane stove that they had there turned on to make some dinner, as the back and forth trips I had made that day had me starving. In the middle of me cooking my meal, I thought I heard a creak of the metal stairs that led up to the top of the tower where I was. I stopped and listened for a minute. I heard it again. This sound was familiar to me because it was the same sound I heard whenever I stepped on the metal stairs leading all the way to the top of the tower. Was someone coming up here? Maybe it was one of the park rangers coming to check on me and make sure I had made it here okay. I walked over to the door and opened it. There was a spot right at the stairs that was kind of open and you could look straight down the tower to the bottom. It was dark and hard to see, but from what I could tell, there was nothing there. At least on my side of the flight of stairs. I called down asking who was there. Nothing. Just silence. I waited for a few more minutes and called out again. A little spooked, I decided to head back inside. Assuming it was just the old creaky stairs shifting in the breeze or something, I decided to push it out of my head and finish cooking. I had just finished eating when I heard the metal creaking again, except this time it was much closer, almost if it was on top of the steps that I was just standing at earlier. I figured it was nothing, but just to be sure I decided to check. I turned on the very dim light for the outside deck and raised the curtain. Then I saw it, a shape, like a person, slowly walking around the deck towards the door. I don't know how I didn't scream, but I managed to keep it in. I quickly dropped the blind, honestly not even getting a good look at whatever it was. I just knew that they shouldn't be there sneaking around like they were. I quickly walked over to the door and locked it. Looking at the flimsy door and lock, I knew if someone wanted to get in, they wouldn't have any issues breaking down the door. Panic set in and I slowly backed away from the door, not sure what to do. I listened quietly and could hear the slow but heavy footsteps finally getting to the door. Then it went quiet. I waited for a few minutes. These few minutes seemed like an eternity. Then I heard the footsteps slowly walk away from the door and back down the stairs. With what little courage I had left, I went to the curtain that was right next to the stairs to see if I could see who or what was just here as they walked away. I slowly raised the blinds. Honestly, I can't even begin to tell you what it was I saw. It was definitely a person, but if a person was twice the size of the biggest human you have ever seen. It almost looked like they were either wearing a really large fluffy hoodie or they were covered in hair. I also only saw the back of their head and shoulders as they were walking down the stairs at this point. I again slowly dropped the blind and went to the radio. I radioed the station and told them what had happened. While I did tell them the truth, I may have left out the part where I looked at the intruder as they were walking down the stairs. I knew deep down what I saw wasn't a human, and didn't want them to think that I was crazy and already having a mental breakdown on day one. Honestly, I wasn't even sure if I believed myself. They asked if the person had left, and I said I thought so, but I wasn't sure. They said they would radio the rangers and have someone out to me as soon as possible. But it may not be until the morning, but to radio back if anything else happens. I sat up in my bed, listening for any sounds. No other sounds came. I was terrified, but finally exhaustion took over. When morning came, I jumped out of bed quickly as I heard my name being called from the ground level. It was the Rangers. I ran down to them quickly. It was still dark outside, but the sun was slowly rising, giving a little more light to the area little by little. I greeted the two Rangers and explained everything that happened. I did tell them about me peeking out the window and watching them leave, but once again did not tell them what I actually saw, just that it was too dark to get any details. By the time I was finishing my conversation with the Rangers, the sun was almost completely up and we could finally see without a flashlight. They told me they would keep an eye out in the area and to be alert and to call back if I witnessed anything else suspicious. I agreed and left as I headed back up to the top of the tower. When I reached the top, I went to open the door to go back inside, but something caught my eye. On the ground was a strange structure made of sticks and leaves. It sort of looked like a Christmas wreath, but if it was made out of things found on the ground. I picked it up. It was very well made, but had to be handcrafted as I couldn't see any machine markings on it at all. However, the weirdest thing was that I felt a sense of calm, almost as if this was a gift. I went back inside and grabbed a hammer and an old nail I had found earlier that evening when I was unpacking. I hammered the nail into the door and hung the wreath on it. Every summer since then, I've returned to the tower, always watching the forest with a weird mix of feelings. While I am honestly terrified of whatever it was that came to the top of my tower that night, I also feel a sense of peace. It was almost like who or whatever it was brought that wreath to me as like a housewarming present. I've never encountered anything like it again, but that night stays with me. I kept a piece of that wreath as a reminder that we aren't alone as we might like to think we are. I've been a Fire Tower Watchman near Seattle for years, through every season. I love solitude, the sweeping views, and the sense of purpose. My German Shepherd, Tank, always accompanies me. He's a great companion, and I think he likes being out here maybe even more than I do. This was like 6 years ago in the middle of the season. We were settling into our routines as the sun started to set. Tank started pacing and whining at the door. I asked him if he needed to go potty, and he jumped at the door. I opened the door and he quickly bolted down the stairs. Usually when he has to go, he waits for me. However, I just assumed he really had to go and honestly was just thankful he told me instead of going in the tower, which would have been a nightmare to clean up since the floors were old wooden planks. I stepped outside, enjoying the crisp air of the forest, waiting for Tank to come back up the stairs. A few minutes later, I still hadn't heard him. I started to get a little worried and yelled out for him. Nothing. Getting slightly worried as this was not typical Tank behavior, I grabbed my flashlight and walked down the stairs calling for Tank. Then, I heard what sounded like Tank whimpering in the woods. I yelled out for him, running down the stairs, worried that maybe he had gotten hurt. I was about halfway down the stairs when suddenly he came back up the stairs, nearly knocking me over. I ran back up after him. When I got inside, he was hiding underneath the bed whimpering. I tried to get him to come out, but he wasn't budging. He seemed absolutely terrified. I needed to know what scared him away. With my flashlight, I went down the tower and looked around the forest, but also didn't want to go too far. There are plenty of animals in the woods that me running into this far out would not be good news for me. It was unusually quiet. Even the normal sounds I'm used to hearing every night seemed to be gone. Not wanting to be down here any longer, I decided to head back up. I couldn't have been more than halfway up when I heard a howl. Low, mournful, and unlike any howl I'd ever heard before. It wasn't any animal I knew, and I've heard them all out here. For a moment, I paused, part of me curious what animal this was, and the other part terrified. My flight response winning out, I sprinted to the top of the tower and locked the door behind me. I waited for a few minutes, waiting to see if I could hear the howl again, but nothing. It was just silent. Once I felt like whatever it was had moved on, I went back to Tank to try to get him to come out, but he still wouldn't move. I figured he would be better in the morning, and I let him stay under the bed. I figured I would get some rest, and I laid down myself. I passed out pretty quickly. I woke up from the loud whimpering sounds Tank was making from under the bed right below me. Before I could try and confront him, a loud creak from outside on the deck made me turn my head quickly towards the door. It sounded like someone was right outside. My heart was pounding so loud I felt like whoever was out there could probably hear it. I slowly got out of bed and looked out the window, but saw nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and started panning it around through the windows across the deck, and that's when I saw it. A giant wolf, far larger than any I'd ever seen. I mean, this wolf had to be 3 times the size of Tank, and Tank is definitely an above average sized German Shepherd. It was a blend of gray and white fur with a black strip down the center of its head. Then, it turned its head and looked right at me. I stumbled back from the window, knocking down things on the table. I crawled backwards to my bed where I kept my rifle. I grabbed the rifle and pointed it towards the window, expecting this giant wolf to jump through it any second. I honestly wasn't even confident my rifle would do anything because it was so big. I waited, but nothing came. Minutes stretched into an eternity, but nothing happened. Eventually, I gathered the courage to look out the window again, and the wolf was gone. No trace it was even ever there. Part of me wanted to go outside to see if it really went back down the stairs, but I couldn't pull myself to do it. I went back to the bed and sat on the floor next to Tank, who was still whimpering. I sort of scooted under the bed closer to him. I told myself it was to comfort Tank, but if I'm being honest now, it was more for myself. The next day I called it in. Rangers came out to investigate, but they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of the massive wolf I described. The Rangers acted like they believed me, but I could tell they were skeptical. But I know what I saw. Tank knows too. He didn't leave my side for days after that night. I'll never forget the sight of that giant wolf or that eerie howl that still sends a shiver down my spine even just thinking about it. Even now, with all my experience in the woods, I can't explain it, but I'll never forget it either.